Oh, sorry guys. Today we're going to be starting with the federal courts, chapter 11. Now before we start with the federal courts, we have to understand one thing, and that is the nature of our judicial system. There's two types of cases that we deal with. Criminal law is dealing with people who have broken certain statutes or certain laws. Running a red light, attacking someone. These are all cases where someone has done something bad and the laws of the nation have determined that that person needs to pay a penalty of some sort. A civil law has to deal with two people who have a dispute between them. So in the case of where a tenant and a landlord might be arguing over rent or who has to pay for fire damage, for example, that's a civil law because it's not necessarily where one person has committed a crime, but it deals with the legality of who's responsible or who owes who. So that's called civil law. Most of these cases have to deal primarily with state law, though. It's states that determine what particular laws are, like for my two examples of what the law is regarding attacking someone, or what the law is regarding running a red light. A person running a red light in Florida would not be subject to the same laws as running a red light in California. And so these are all state court issues, mainly. Now in the system, it's built around an adversarial, sort of conflict-driven system. The idea is that if we have somebody representing both sides and they both argue their case, we can decide on the best one. We can decide on which one's more valid. It wouldn't really work if we only had one side represented. That would be like a district attorney getting to accuse someone of a crime, but then the defendant not being able to defend themselves. That doesn't really work. So we built it around this sort of adversarial system where the two sides are represented. The first side is the plaintiff. Sorry, both of them are called litigants. Litigants are the people who the main issue is concerning. So either the plaintiff or the defendant. The plaintiff is the person who's bringing a charge. So in the case of someone who's been assaulted, they bring the charge against the person who assaulted them. Usually that person's represented by the DA, who represents the state or the city or whoever is representing the interests of the law in this case. The defendant is the person who committed the crime or allegedly committed the crime, and they're defending themselves. In the case of a civil law, the plaintiff is the person who is suing. The defendant is also defending against this suit, arguing that they either don't need to pay or they might even countersue. Court cases also deal with a jury, normally 12, who decide the outcome of the cases. Now we'll get into a little bit about different types of juries, but this is normally what we see is the 12 jury of peers who decide who's in the right in a particular case. Now there's other groups that are involved. In cases that make it to appeals court or cases that make it to the Supreme Court, you have groups that try to kind of influence it. For example, the NRA, the National Rifle Association, they might try to influence the court to rule in favor of gun rights. How that's done is mainly through what's called an amicus curiae or an amicus curiae brief. That means friend of the court. Now what they'll do is they'll typically put forward their argument and they'll try to cite previous Supreme Court rulings to argue in their favor. They might use some constitutional law or maybe just some run-of-the-mill law, and they'll try to defend their point. And that will get added into sort of the court's decision. And the court can read that and decide whether or not that's valid. And they can even use that in writing their own decision. The last group that is represented here is attorneys. These are the people who represent the people who are the plaintiffs or the defendants. So if you are being accused of stealing something, you're going to have an attorney represent you. If you're suing someone, you're going to have an attorney who's there to assist you. Now, unfortunately, the system is built around these attorneys. Some attorneys are better than others, and they're able to charge higher fees for their services. And so that's why you might see like a big oil company or a big drug company. They'll have like an entire law devoted just to them, and they'll have a lot of money invested into that to represent their interests in cases. And us little people might have a harder time finding a lawyer that will represent us, that will be as good of quality. As we can see, not all lawyers are created equal. But we do know that the court's been built around the idea that all people should be represented. So that means even if you're too poor to have a lawyer, you can have one appointed to you by the court. Now here is a schematic, a tree that shows the organization of the federal court system. Now, as I said, we're mainly going to deal with the federal courts, not with the state courts. States might deal with things like running red lights or assaults or robberies, but federal courts deal with federal issues. For example, let's say an assault. If I assault a regular person, that would be a state issue. If I assaulted an FBI agent or you know, a senator or something, that's a federal employee. And as a federal employee, they're entitled to federal protections, and so that case would go before a federal district court. They also have independent regulatory agencies and also specialized courts, so like tax court for bankruptcy or things like that. These are things that deal with sort of national law that need to be the same in all areas, whereas a district court might have to deal with a particular issue in a region. This is a far more national issue here. Now, your case might be originally decided in these lower courts, and you might decide that you don't like the ruling. You might feel that maybe your rights were violated in the court process. Maybe someone tampered with the evidence. In that case, you would be able to appeal your case to a higher court. In this case, it's called the Court of Appeals. There are 12 of them in the United States. We live in California, so we are represented by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And they deal with all appeals that occur from these district courts. Now, let's say you're dealing with something regarding like tax law or something like that. You would go up through here to the Court of Appeals for Federal Circuit because, again, as I said, that's more of a national issue thing. That has to be consistent through all the districts. An important thing to note here is that district courts hold what's called original jurisdiction. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But original jurisdiction basically means that they get to hear the case first. The Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court, they have what's called appellate jurisdiction. And that means they can only hear cases once they've been appealed. So you have your case here, then it's appealed, and it can be appealed again. Now there's another branch over here. This is for military courts. They have their own system. So if you're planning on joining the military, please remember that you're going to be considered in a separate group. And they have their own appeals and judicial processes there. Now let's talk about those different levels of courts. The district courts have what's called original jurisdiction. That means they have the authority to rule on cases that start there. So the cases start in this court. This is where you have your trial court. So this is the one that's determined by judges and juries and things like that. The ones that you guys are most familiar with seeing on court dramas or police dramas. Now, because this is a federal court system, federal district courts, they deal with federal crimes. So this would not be like, for example, I don't know, it's somebody, a state that might make marijuana illegal. Okay? That would be a state issue. But there is also a federal issue that has determined that marijuana is legal. So that could be appealed to a federal crimes unit as a banned substance. The cases that it mainly deals with are civil suits under federal laws. So people suing other people. Mainly, you can deal with issues like tax purposes or other businesses that operate across state lines. So it would be wrong for a California court to rule on something that has to deal in multiple states. A California court cannot determine what happens in an Arizona city. And so federal courts deal with that issue across state lines. They also deal with bankruptcy, as that's mainly a tax issue, and immigration and naturalization, as you can see right here. They also review federal agencies. And they also deal with maritime. That means any things that happen out on sea. Let's say you're on a cruise and a crime has been committed. That would fall under a federal court, obviously because you're not in any particular state. Now, once your case has been tried in a district court, you can appeal it. The Court of Appeals can hear your case because they have what's called appellate jurisdiction. Appellate jurisdiction means they can review lower cases or cases brought from lower courts, but they mainly only do this for legal issues. They really don't care what the ruling of the case was. They care about how the ruling was reached, whether or not the issues were legal or not. They don't hold trials and hear testimony. They only review the case. As I mentioned, there are 12 circuit courts. We live in the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals area. And the United States Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit mainly deals with these specialized cases. And as I mentioned, they focus on errors of procedure and law, whether or not your rights have been violated by the process. Let's say, for example, I was interrogated and I gave a confession. Well, if I was never informed of my rights, but I was convicted of it, I could appeal that to a court of appeals and say, hey, look, my Fifth Amendment was violated. And that would be something that a court of appeals would review because that was an error of procedure and definitely an error when it comes to constitutional law. Now, the Supreme Court is what's called the court of last resort. It's the highest court in all the land. That Supreme Court has 9 justices, 1 Chief Justice, and 8 Associate Justices. The Chief Justice kind of runs the show. He determines certain things like who writes certain opinions, or the majority opinion. But they all have an equal vote. The Supreme Court decides which cases it will hear. Typically, one particular judge will have a desire to listen to a particular case, and they have to get 3 other judges to agree with them, or justices to agree with them. Once you have 4 Supreme Court justices to agree, then they'll hear a case. Now, there's over 7,500 cases that come before the Supreme Court every year. There's no way they're going to hear every single one of them, so they have to kind of pare it down. They do have some original jurisdiction in some cases, but mostly they deal with appellate jurisdiction. That means you had your case at the district court and you appealed it to an appellate court, your 9th Circuit Court of Appeals. And maybe they got it wrong, and so you appeal it to the federal court. That's mainly what the Supreme Court deals with. They can also deal with issues that come from state courts. So let's say the state of California ruled on an issue, and you didn't like how it ruled against your favor, and so you appeal it to the federal court system through either the appellate court or through the state Supreme Court. However, for the federal court system, most of those cases come through the lower federal district courts, and most are civil cases. Okay, that's the end of the first video. Please click on the next video to continue. Thank you very much.